Wish We Could Turn Back Time by Girlinpink44, Chapter 14, Howard's Mess. If Pepper asked, Tony would never admit he was sulking down in his workshop. On one hand, he loved being back in this workshop versus either of his labs in New York. There was something about this place where he had done some of his best work. That had been one of the hardest things about losing the house. And Jarvis was there. His old friend was in touch with his wants and needs as he remembered. There was a part of him that missed Friday. The part that acknowledged that some of her base codes was sitting somewhere in his server. But he didn't know what purpose she would serve if he ever brought her online. She was too special to delegate to something. Maybe he'd think of something someday. But while some of him missed the plucky Irish accented AI, a lot of him had missed Jarvis more. So? Tony looked up from the flight stabilizer he was tweaking. The gauntlet almost finished. If he kept this pace, he might have a full suit in the next couple of weeks. But, at the same time, he had been doing his best to have a better life-work balance than he did have in the previous timeline. Plus, he was deciding if it was worth darting back across the country to see at least one of his kids when the weekend hit. Pepper was trying to talk him out of the idea, mainly because she didn't want to draw attention to either too early. Both knew it was a matter of time before the press caught wind of Tony's emotional adoption of 2 kids. But at this point, as far as they were concerned, he was still too close to his parting days for them to have any sort of understanding. Not that they did anyways, especially at the present time. He was aware that the press alternated between curiosity and mocking his press conference from almost 2 weeks ago. There was speculation as to why he suddenly flown to New York over the weekend and stayed for several days, often dropping off the map into a largely monitored city. Honestly, this was one of the first times he had managed to find himself alone since the desert. He had had Rhodey, or Pepper, or Happy, or one of the kids. Or the Time Stone, even around almost all the time. Normally, he'd find that a bit suffocating. Honestly, he did a bit, but at the same time having some of them around soothed him and irritated part of his soul that hadn't quite finished mending itself in the last 5 years. So? Tony shook his head and looked away from the gauntlet. Yeah, Jay? Miss Potts says to tell you that dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Thanks, Jay. Tony smiled, stepping away from the gauntlet. Double check my math on the flight stabilizer, Jay. I think I remembered everything, but it doesn't hurt to check. Of course. There was a pause, as if there was something Jarvis wanted to say, but wasn't. What's up, Jay? Tony sat in his desk chair, ready for logging in his progress for the day. I find myself feeling inadequate, a feeling I am not used to. How so? The hesitation in the AI's voice got Tony to stop. I was designed to keep you safe and assist you. But now, it feels as if I am unable to fulfill my primary directive, as you have knowledge of threats I cannot even begin to be aware of. The rest of your family doesn't have that limitation. Tony put a hand on a monitor, a symbolic gesture more than anything, since Jarvis didn't have a physical form. Jay. You. Just having you here does a lot. Your little sister did an excellent job, but she didn't have the experience you and I have. It doesn't matter if you don't have knowledge of what's to come. In fact, it might be to our benefit. There was a pause. How so, sir? To anyone that wasn't Tony, he was sure the sound of hope in the AI's voice would have seemed odd. But these AIs were a passion project of his, and he was proud of how advanced they seemed. Most people forgot that Jay was the basis of his dissertation for his doctorate in computer engineering. Granted, back then, he'd been a lot less advanced, but still beyond anything in the field of AIs at the time. It wasn't surprising that people forgot, considering they often forgot he had doctorates half the time. But back to his digital son. A fresh set of eyes. I might be too busy looking 5, 10, even the full 15 years into the future, and missing something here in the present. You'll help keep me grounded.
There has to be a balance. I need to make changes, and we already have. But we can't take too many obvious changes. I think I see.
Tony smiled.
You've always given me good advice, Joe. You're probably my closest confidant. I need you for what's ahead, as much as I need the rest of our time team.
Some people might say something about one of his closest friends being an AI that he had created. But at the end of the day, Jay had always been that way. It might be part of the reason he leaned into the rest of his family more, as he also pushed them away, but in his defense, he wasn't always sure what to do with his feelings when he had lost him in the whole Ultron fiasco.
Of course, sir. Well, as your eye in the present, I have a question about a pressing issue. And that is? Stain. How are you going to handle that this time around?
That gave Tony pause. Honestly, it wasn't like Tony had forgotten his first big bad. A term Peter had given Stain one day that Tony found endlessly amusing was still out and about. It was odd seeing him. Ignoring the fact that the man was actively stabbing him in the back for a second, from Tony's point of view, the man had been dead for 15 years. Seeing him alive again was hard. He worked through a lot of his emotions. But he'd always wished there'd been a way to end this altercation with Stain living so he could face justice. So the word could get out that the real Merchant of Death was Obadiah Stane, and not Tony Stark. Or was it? In some ways, wasn't Tony just as guilty? He'd been oblivious, too trusting, naive in a way he'd forever regret. Even this reset couldn't erase the damage his inaction had caused.
So?
Tony looked where he knew a camera was.
Dig into the SI servers. Find everything beyond the documents we got last week. Unlike last time, he will face justice for his actions, for the lives that were lost due to his greed. The world will know of his crimes, and he'll be no more than a footnote in my career as Iron Man. Understood, sir. I will make sure I use the utmost discretion. It's on a ghost drive, Jay. All of it. Look for any of them in our system. Of course, sir.
Tony smiled, letting his old friend's voice wash over him.
And, Joe? Yes? I'm glad you're here. Always, sir.
If there was one thing that Tony hated, it was the fact that in multiple ways he was cleaning up his father's mess, and would be for years to come. Obadiah was a backstabbing traitor that his father partnered with. His father decided to build his legacy on weapons that his business partner decided to deal under the table. He couldn't forget that technically the second big bad he'd ever faced was born out of his father's harsh and rash rejections. Oh, and the plethora of issues that his father had caused that would probably always wreak havoc on his mental health. The ones that caused him to push Peter away, and the ones that filled him with guilt when his son in all but blood dissolved into ash. And now, his father had done something that would make his next task very difficult. He was driving a rented car through the streets of San Diego, towards where Hank Pym was holed up with the experiments he was trying to find his wife. To be honest, Tony wasn't entirely sure what exactly had gone down between him and his father, but the man's brains and research and plans were valuable in the upcoming plan. Finding himself in the warehouse district of the city, he parked. Tapping his earpiece, he let out a sigh.
Jay, are you with me? Always, sir. This might be rough.
He knocked on the door of the warehouse. A moment later, he heard movement on the other side, and the door flew open. Standing in front of him was Hank Pym. The man's eyes went wide before narrowing in rage, and the door slammed.
Dr. Pym, I need your help.
Tough luck, Tony sighed.
Dr. Pym, I have no idea what happened between you and my father. But when I say the fate of the universe itself might be in your hand at this moment, I'm not exaggerating.
There was a pause, and the door opened. You have 2 minutes.
Dr. Pym, something is coming. Something that with you and your research, we might be able to stop. You won't believe me if I tell you what it is, and how I know about it.
Try me. The man crossed his arms. After what your father did, I have a policy to never trust a Stark.
What did my father do?
He stole from me in 1970, and then buried me and my career and my research in an attempt to save his own ass.
Wait.
Tony couldn't help but chuckle.
April 7th, 1970?
Hank's eyes narrowed. How did you know?
That answer might require more than 2 minutes.
Tony realised he would have to put far more cards on the table than he had intended.
And, to be honest, I'm not sure you'll believe me.
Try me. Tony looked around the makeshift lab, for not the first time, regretting his father's tendencies to be rash when his temper flared. Granted, Tony was more than aware at times. He did the same thing. There were times he wore the badge and title of Avenger with pride, because vengeance, when you'd been hurt, felt so good. Honestly, it was another reason why Peter was better than he had ever been, no matter what the kid claimed.
I know what happened to Janet.
He decided to lay that chip on the table. It had been one he had intended to before the meeting was done. Hank visibly paled at the declaration.
How could you possibly know anything about that? In 10 years, a being called Thanos will snap his fingers and use what's known as the Infinity Stones to wipe out half the universe. Unbeknownst to all of us, Scott Lang didn't disappear. He was simply stuck in the quantum realm where you and Hope vanished. Half the universe?
Hank leaned against the counter.
With the snap of his fingers. You realise how crazy it sounds? You're implying that I'm from the future. Not a lot of people know that, but after almost 40 years, you deserve to know what happened in 1970. In my defence, I didn't realise it until just now.
What happened? How did you get here?
5 years passed. I retired. Married the love of my life. Had a daughter. Tried to move on after losing my sons in the snap. I'm so sorry.
Hank's face was the softest Tony had ever seen it.
I can't imagine losing Hope like that. Luckily for you, you were both among the vanished. I'm glad you didn't have to feel that pain. With one exception, I was told you wouldn't have suffered.
Small mercies in the face of missing half the universe. Tony nodded.
Something happened. To be honest, I never got the full details. And Scott Lang got out.
How did Scott come to gain access to my tech?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure. I only met the man a couple of times, and none of them were exactly times for catching up.
Hank conceded to the lack of answer, an action that surprised Tony. How does this play into what happened in 1970? I have to admit, I find your story intriguing.
Scott came to my facility in New York.
The New Yorker finally went back to where he belonged?
Tony laughed. Guilty. I love California, but I'll be making that move sooner than I did last time. New York is home for me. One of my kids is from there. Finish your story.
Finish your story.
To him, it had only been hours, whereas it was years for us outside the quantum realm. Steve Rogers.
He died.
Long story. He's in a state of suspended animation at the moment. He'll be defrosted in a few years.
As far as Tony was concerned, Cap could stay frozen. While Tony was aware he had his uses, he was not looking forward to meeting him.
Regardless, Cap and a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent whose codename is Black Widow, I've heard of her, came to visit me and present the idea I could build off your research and possibly create time travel and give us a way to fix this. I told them no. I had found as close to a happy ending as I could. I couldn't risk my daughter's life. But then...
You realised you had a chance to get your sons back. Tony nodded.
So I had to try. Peter's a fan of yours, by the way. Read a bunch of your papers. I once caught him reading your entomology dissertation once.
How old was he?
16. He was researching a project and hoped it would help.
Considering being an entomologist? Hank Pym seemed far too amused at the idea.
No, he's an engineer and a chemist through and through. It's complicated, and if we come out of this discussion on good terms, I might get your help and advice on that project.
Continue your story. This Lang fellow gave you access to my research?
And I figured out how to create a quantum tunnel. You used my research to create a method of time travel!
At that moment, a lot of Hank's years seemed to melt off his face at the implication.
I need to know more about that.
Tony grinned.
We went to 2012. 2 of the stones were in New York City at the time. I planned to snag one on the same day this time around, but one of the stones got away from us. I knew it was in that bunker in 1970, and I also knew that there were Pym particles stored there. We'd need them to return home,
and to be able to travel and return the stones once we accomplish our mission. So you travelled further back in time, stole the lost stone and my particles, and set your father and me into a feud.
In my defense, I didn't connect those dots until today. I'm sorry I stole your tech, but the fate of the universe and my sons was on the balance.
You did it. Tony nodded.
We fixed it, but things went wrong. There was a battle. We were losing. I took the stones from Thanos and snapped him and his army dead. And then I died.
But how are you here?
The stones. They are 6 in number.
Tony found a stray piece of paper and drew 6 circles, labelling each of them.
Time, space, soul, power, reality, and mind. They govern an aspect of the universe and were created in the Big Bang.
That had to be a lot of power.
You wouldn't believe what it felt like.
Tony winced at the memory of the pain of bearing the 6 stones.
I died from it. And then the stones talked to me. Told me the cost was too great. They sent me back to fix it from where it all began.
1. Tony gave the man a look.
1 what?
You said you were going to grab one of the 2 stones in New York that day.
What of the other? I've already made contact with the keeper of the other. Until closer to the endgame, it's safe with them.
Tony nodded.
My tech helped save the universe? It did. And with that, I have a proposition for you.
Tony picked up the briefcase he'd sat on the floor and opened it, and took out a folder.
Pym Technologies partners with Stark Industries as part of our new initiatives. I've already seen that there's a lot of potential for your research. Take your time reading over this contract. It'll heal damage my father did to your name, and allow you the facilities you need.
And in return?
Be open to working on projects and make sure half the universe doesn't disappear. And, if you're willing, I have a personal project that might benefit from your expertise.
The one your son was looking into?
Tony nodded. Norman Osborn.
What did he manage to do?
Genetic experimentation, of which my son was an unwilling participant.
Hank recoiled. What happened?
Bit by a radioactive spider. When we were all sent back, his powers came with him. He was reading your papers to see if he could get any insight into how his DNA might affect him as he finished going through puberty.
How much of his DNA is arachne?
2%.
Fascinating. Tony pulled out a second folder.
With the contract, I don't mind if it leaks. But please, I've seen what happens if the world finds out about him, and I can't let that happen.
Hank nodded. Of course, Dr. Stark. Give me time to review both of these. And perhaps when he's on summer break, I can examine your son myself. See what arachne tendencies he's showing.
He'd love that.
End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you'll enjoy that. Okay, I really like this. He's mending the rifts and figuring things out. I love that he wants to talk to Hank about Peter's experimentation and what happened with Norman Osborn. I know that's not canon to the MCU, but It's the quintessential superhero origin story, isn't it? Right alongside dead parents. And Peter's got those too, so I'm happy that the kid's having a better life right now. And yeah, I just like this chapter and the fact that Hank is open to listening and can see that Tony's being honest. I like that. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care. Bye.